And now I'm just going to hand over to Rebecca and allow her to run the symposium. Do pop chat questions in the chat as and when you think of them, and I'll allow Rebecca to decide how she wants to handle those questions throughout. So thank you very much. That's all from me for now.
Great. Well, thank you, Rebecca, so much for inviting us. We actually submitted a version of this symposium to the 2020 meeting of IMBES that was supposed to happen in Montreal. And so it's really been a joy to see how our thinking about this issue has evolved over the years and to finally get a chance to discuss this with everyone here. And the reason we submitted it to IMBES in particular is we really wanted a chance to discuss with people from diverse backgrounds, in particular those with an interest in education, about some of the sort of controversies in this field or things we have been wrestling with in terms of how this might apply to early math education in particular. And I should say that Jane Hutchison and Eric Wilkie were originally supposed to be part of the symposium as well, but they aren't able today to join us. So I just wanted to give a bit of a background of the research that kind of underlies all of the speakers' work. And I want to say I'm grateful to work in such a collaborative subfield, and it's great to see so many names in the chat too of other people like Emma Blakey and Ilse Coolin and Gaia Sheriff who work in this area. So I hope we can have a really lively discussion. And we do mean it. Please put things in the chat at any time, and we'd be happy to take questions throughout. We really want this to be interactive. So on that note, I want to start with a bit of a experiment. I'd like to know what people think of when I say, what are executive functions? If you're feeling brave, maybe type in the chat how you might define executive functions, or if you want to unmute and shout out an answer as well. I'm curious to see what we all think and if we agree on what executive functions are. Okay, good. So I'm seeing control center of the brain, cognitive flexibility, in prefrontal cortex, working memory, maintaining goals, self-management, a little homunculus in the brain controlling our behaviors and actions, planning, decision-making. Okay, great. An umbrella term for certain cognitive capacities, CEO of the brain. Great, so these all kind of hit on this definition that I've chosen here. We sort of broadly agree that they're cognitive skills used for directing attention, ignoring distractions, and planning and goal setting. And as some in the chat mentioned, in the sort of cognitive psychology model, based mostly on the work of Miyake and colleagues, they're often categorized into three separable but related functions, which are working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility. One of the things we want to talk about throughout the symposium today is whether, what are the limitations of this definition and how might we kind of push our thinking more about what executive functions really are and how they might vary with individual differences. And in particular, we know of something called the task impurity problem, which is the idea that it's really difficult to measure executive functions independently of the cognitive demands of the task and sort of prior knowledge or other information about the stimuli used in the tasks. And so one common approach has been to use a sort of broad battery of tasks with different types of stimuli and task demands, and then trying to calculate a latent variable that is thought to be this kind of control variable that underlies executive function. But there's increasing research too showing that the development of executive functions is shaped by a myriad factors in children's environment, including stress and poverty. So that's something else we have to keep in mind when measuring executive functions. And Sabine Dubel wrote about this in a piece she called Rethinking Executive Functions. She argued that because executive functions develop through all these social and environmental ways, we therefore must be considering children's prior knowledge and diverse goals and beliefs when we measure executive function, and that executive function might be better understood as the emergence of skills in using control in the service of specific goals. And again, I've bolded here the service of specific goals because, as I've just mentioned, with sort of different task demands or different stimuli, the goals might be different. And in particular, different students might have different goals. They might not necessarily have the same goals that the researchers had in mind when designing these tasks. And so And again, we're all here to talk about how executive functions are related to mathematics learning. And the talks today will all focus on this in different ways, but to just give a bit of background, we know from a lot of research that executive functions are correlated with mathematics achievement, but the causal directions of this relationship are not clear. So it could be that, going to math class is a good exercise for your working memory and that improves working memory. Or it could be that, children with strong executive functions might be better able to learn math in the first place. And there is a lot of research showing that rather than being this sort of like homunculus, as Andy put it, or being able to look at executive function in isolation, that actually there might even be sort of number specific executive functions. Or in other words, research has shown that executive functions measured with tasks that include mathematically relevant information are more strongly related to math performance. And so we were counting on Eric Wilkie to put the neuroscience in this educational neuroscience symposium, but unfortunately he is actually teaching the neuroscience of executive functions to Vanderbilt students today, but he kindly shared some slides to give a bit of an overview of his work in this area. And here are some examples of math stimuli where you might need to inhibit distractions. So for example, when looking at a number of objects, being able to attend a number might require inhibiting the spatial orientation or the size of the objects. Here's another example, if you ask which one of these has a larger proportion of red, the bigger image might be distracting and you think that's more red. When you look at the proportions, really the smaller one has more red. And same with this whole number bias. 5 is a bigger number than 4, which can lead some students to misinterpret this as being a larger value than 1/4. And so Eric, in a series of neuroimaging and behavioral studies, has really looked at this, showing that there's neural signatures associated with attending to number-specific information. For example, in one study, there was activity in the interparietal sulcus and inferior frontal gyrus related to attention specifically to number. So this again is contrasting tasks that require inhibiting numerical or mathematical information versus tasks that require verbal or other types of information. He's also found that children with dyscalculia or mathematical learning difficulty in particular have trouble with these sort of incongruent, non-symbolic number comparisons where they're more likely to be distracted by irrelevant size cues. So that suggests they may have trouble attending to number. And then it's also found that this is related, the sort of neural activation shown when looking at or inhibiting number-related information is also related to children's math achievement in 3rd graders. And if you want to see more of his work, I really encourage you to go check out his website. And so, as I mentioned, this causal direction is not clear, but increasing evidence is showing that there might be reciprocal relations between executive functions and math instruction, so that having strong executive functions might help children learn more easily starting school, but that likewise acquiring and practicing these skills could in turn build stronger EFs over time. And in particular, looking at individual differences across children from different socioeconomic backgrounds, some research has suggested that executive functions might be a protective factor and something that's worth targeting for intervention for promoting early learning. I just want to share, this is data from a big US national data set that actually Andy and Dana will talk more about, the ECLSK. And we look at the correlation between working memory score on the x-axis and math score, this is in 4th graders, on the y-axis. We see that this relationship seems steeper in children from low socioeconomic families versus children growing up not in higher socioeconomic families. And so this, again, is correlational evidence suggesting that targeting EFs, particularly in children growing up in lower income homes, might help them with math learning at school. And so today we want to dig a bit deeper into some of the nuances of these findings. And so we'll be hearing from Andrew, Dana, and Caylee, who are each going to address different questions related to the relationship between executive function and math. And so I'll stop sharing my screen now so Andy can share his, and happy to take any questions or comments as Andy's setting up.
Sorry, I lost my control bar and couldn't unmute myself. Hi, it's so wonderful to see so many faces here. Um, I am really excited to kind of pick up a little bit where Rebecca left off. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for that phenomenal introduction. So I am going to be presenting a little bit of work that I've presented in some form before, looking at exploring longitudinal relations between executive function and math in the early childhood longitudinal study kindergarten cohort, the more recent one, which was a data set that Rebecca briefly mentioned, and talk about the implications of modeling on development of theory and practice. I definitely encourage you throughout this and all of our other presentations, and you'll hear us say this over and over again, please drop things in the chat. I might not be able to find the chat where I am right now, but we're really excited to kind of compile people's comments, thoughts, ideas, questions. They don't have to be fully formed questions. They can be kind of thoughts that we can compile and address in kind of a discussion roundtable toward the end of our presentation today. So I want to start with a quote that many of us have seen before, or kind of an adage that we see throughout the field, and that's that there is nothing as practical as a good theory, and this is credited to Kurt Lewin. So I want to talk a little bit about this background of where I'm coming from. A lot of this is going to echo what Rebecca said. So we know that math and executive function skills are robustly correlated with one another across the lifespan, but that the directional association between EF and math is uncertain, as Rebecca mentioned. And it remains to be seen whether there is a causal relation between executive function and math. And this is something that I'm hoping that we're going to get into in kind of our discussion later as we talk about what are the issues with testing the causal relations here, and whether it's something that we can actually do, given that we have a pretty poor track record of intervening on executive function as a domain general skill as a field. So thinking about some of the kind of theoretical approaches that I'm bringing into this, I really think about some of the work that Robbie Case did in the late 1900s, and thinking about these kind of core capacities. And he says in this developmentally based theory and technology of instruction paper in 1978, two of the most widely documented principles that have emerged from the study of intellectual development are A, that young children approach intellectual tasks with strategies that are reasonable but oversimplified, and B, that young children are incapable of dealing with more than a few items of information at one time. And really the second piece, but both, are the idea of kind of strategy selection and strategy development, and then dealing with multiple pieces of information, I think are really core to what we think about as executive function. And we see those kind of highlighted here as being the things that we can build off of in Case's theory, these core capacities, speed, span, and control, which are in this iteration kind of more closely related to working memory specifically, but also to executive function writ large. And so when I think about the relation between executive function and mathematics, I think of it as kind of being two pathways. And one of them is through the process of learning math, and the other is through the process of doing math. And I think that these operate as kind of independent pathways. And I would love to get into conversations later. I know I've been in conversation with some people here about thinking about the ways that we might be able to test the process of learning math and the process of doing math, whether those are separable, whether those are related to one another, and whether there is this kind of two pathway system relating executive function to math. And part of the reason I think about this is because one would think that the kind of learning math, or the learning piece altogether, would be related to classroom learning generally. We integrate new information into our existing information. We update our representations of things. Part of that is that math is hierarchical. Everything we do in mathematics builds on something we've learned previously in mathematics, which is not necessarily the case for reading, writing, and language development. But I think there is this special pathway for the process of doing math also, where that might be unique from the kinds of skills that we test when we're testing things like literacy development. which might partially explain the stronger relation between executive function and math and executive function than executive function and reading. And so a couple of papers have kind of looked at this, looking at executive function as interrupting stability in mathematical skills. We know that math is highly stable, which can kind of draw a negative picture. If we think about kids who enter school with higher degrees of mathematical skills, tend to outperform their peers who have lower levels of mathematical skills. And we see that rank order stability continues over time. But we see that children with high levels of executive function are better able to disrupt that stability. So a lot of people have talked about different approaches to modeling executive function in math, thinking about these kind of cross-lagged panel models, looking at each skill affecting both the stability in that skill and the cross-domain association over time, over and above kind of the extent to which those are correlated at a given time point. We've seen folks who have modeled different approaches to executive function in math, whether that be kind of overlapping constructs of executive function in math, where we see that there is some kind of loading of each of these component skills onto mathematics, or that executive function writ large is the overlap of these skills that contributes to mathematics. And then we see things like these random intercept cross-lag panel models, which seek to kind of parcel out the differences in within and between group associations in the growth of mathematical skills and executive function over time. So what I'm seeking to do here is to look at, one, how do ways of modeling the dynamic relations between executive function and math affect the theoretical conclusions we can draw? And then two, based on different ways of modeling the relations between executive function and math, is there greater support for one directional hypothesis? So we talked a little bit about the uncertainty of causality and also the uncertainty of directionality. There's certainly some people hold that executive function supports the development of mathematical skills, and some suggest that there is this bidirectional association where each predicts growth in the other skill. So the data that I'll be using is that ECLSK that we mentioned. This is the early childhood longitudinal study kindergarten cohort of 2010-2011. This is a total sample of about 18,000 kindergartens who were recruited from nearly 1,000 schools across the United States. This is meant to be nationally representative of all children in the United States. Here we're restricting it to a subset of 12,000 students. It's great to have data sets that you can exclude huge numbers of kids and still have 12,000 observations or 12,000 cases. So we're excluding kids who were not in a non-target grade at any point of data collection, had an IEP or any kind of on paper learning disability, and folks who did not take place in the first wave of data collection. So we look at parent or caregiver figures who completed a phone interview at each time point to report demographic, household, and child information, and I'll discuss those covariates in just a moment. And in particular, we're looking at the standardized math assessment and the two standardized tests of executive function, from which we create, which we're only using one. So we're not using a z-scored composite or anything. We are just using the numbers reverse task in this particular measure. And then we're only using, though there's data available through the 5th grade at this point, looking at spring data collection in 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. We're only using the data from the kindergarten through 2nd grade time points, largely because I'm more interested in early development, and because I think that there's a role for executive function as being particularly relevant to mathematical skill learning in early developmental periods. So just to take a quick look at the measures that we're using, this is from an old presentation. Sorry about that. We're using the numbers reverse task, which is where I give a series of digits and then ask you to repeat that digit span backwards to me. So this has both the memory, the keeping in mind, and the updating component, because when I give you this string of numbers, be it 1, 2, 3, 4, you need to then reverse those numbers and give them backwards, 4, 3, 2, 1. Obviously, we try to give numbers that are a little bit less linear and sequential than these ones. Long list of covariates that we're including. I'm not going to get into those too much because they're not actually incredibly relevant. I just think it's important to look at or factor out some of these associations that we know are associated with both mathematical skills and executive function skills. So the first approach that we take here is to use an autoregressive cross-lag panel model. And so what we're doing here is looking at both stability in mathematical skills. This is a vertically scaled test of mathematical skills where children are tested in the fall and spring of each academic year from kindergarten, first grade, and second grade, where we expect to see substantial stability in mathematical skills, and then in working memory over and above. So we're looking at stability, and then over and above that stability, we want to look at, is there an association for this cross-lagged pathway? Does each next data point, data collection, is it predicted by the cross-domain skill over and above both the degree to which they're correlated and the stability in the same skill over time? And indeed, we see that all of these pathways are significant. We see that both scores are correlated at each time point. We see that there's stability in skills, and we see this cross-lagged association. So what does this mean? Well, first of all, the model fits the data fairly well. So that's great. And this suggests that there's an additive bidirectional association between executive function and math. So thinking about the implication for theory and practice, we see that executive function and math each support the development of the other, and that intervening on either math or executive function at any given time throughout early elementary grades should result in greater domain, within domain and cross-domain skills. And we would expect this to, yeah.
There's a question in the chat that's relevant. So I'm curious about why you screened out kids with IEPs. Is that a feature of the ECLSK, or but it could be an important factor after K-2 especially?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think it's interesting to do, or it would be interesting to do some subgroup analyses looking at different IEPs, but I think just because this was meant to be kind of a large heuristic, and because in all honesty, this is the same limitations that I put on my dissertation data when I was using look too much into kind of alternative explanations and alternative groups. I think it's important to look at the IAPs, but I think it might be a little bit, it would potentially be somewhat limiting to look at only one or to lump in everyone with all forms of learning. That said, I think that there is reason to think that this would be universal across all students. So the next approach that I took was a parallel process growth model, and I have slides for the single process growth models that I built, where we looked at the both the starting point using the intercept and the rate of change in each set of skills over time. And then we allow those starting points and the rate of change to correlate with one another, and then look at the relative association between not just the starting point and rate of change in math and the starting point and rate of change in executive function, but also, again, the extent to which the starting point in math predicts the rate of change in math. And here again, we see that these are all significant pathways. We see that the starting point in math is significantly correlated with slope. This is actually a negative correlation where kids at a higher degree or at a higher level of skill in mathematics tends to grow at a slower rate, in part because there's some ceiling effects. And we see that the starting point of executive function is weakly, but still significantly correlated with the rate of change in executive function. But over and above that, we see these cross-lagged models, these cross-lagged associations, again, where the rate of change is predicted by the starting point in each of those other skills. So again, the model fits the data fairly well. And this suggests bidirectional associations between executive function and math. And what we can take from these set of models is that executive function and math each support the development of the other. This is exactly the same as we saw in the last model. And that intervening on either math or executive function early in elementary grades should result in a greater rate of change within domain skills and cross-domain skills. So building it up one step from here, looking at this parallel process growth model with structured residuals, also a cross-slide panel model with structured residuals. Here we build this same model out. We allow the intercept to correlate and the slope to correlate, but here we are taking the residuals and allowing them form this same cross-slide panel model that we saw in the first model. So we can think about this as within person change and this as between person change, these associations between the intercept and slope, because we know that these are going to be correlated over time. And indeed, we see that, yes, these are correlated. The starting point of math, starting point of EF at a group level is correlated, and the rate of change are correlated with one another. And we again see these cross-domain associations where children who have higher degrees of mathematical skills and higher degrees of executive function skills at school start tend to develop the cross skill at a greater point. But that's at a group-wise level. This is at an aggregate. So what I'm really interested in is this within person change. And here we see that there is still substantial stability. This is unsurprising. We see correlated starting points, correlated ending points, and we see stability in the rate of change in math, or the mathematical skills, and in executive function skills. But here we actually only see a single or a unidirectional association where early executive function predicts later math.
And just a couple of clarification questions. Sorry, you mentioned that you're modeling the digits reverse task. A couple of questions about whether you also modeled other executive measures.
I'm going to get to that at the end, if that's okay.
Okay.
So here, this actually suggests a different situation where we see these results are stronger at earlier time points. So there's a time-sensitive association between EF and math, and that these are unidirectional associations where executive function predicts math, but not vice versa. So using the same data and the same outcomes, we see that executive function supports the development of mathematical skills, but not vice versa. And here we would suggest that intervening on early EF should result in a greater rate of growth in cross-domain skills, but there remains a high degree of stability in each skill over time. So taking these same data from the three different modeling approaches, we see substantially different conclusions that we can draw. So these first two approaches suggest that there's a bidirectional association, whereas this last suggests that there's a unidirectional association. And these latter two approaches to modeling suggest a particular relevance for early intervention, whereas this cross-slide panel model doesn't find that same unique association. So the big takeaways that I see here, the ways that we model the relations between these two dynamic constructs can substantially change the conclusions for theory and practice. There seems to be some within individual directional associations wherein executive function supports mathematical skills, though on the whole, the development of both skills is correlated over time. And that the relations between executive function and math might be stronger in earlier grades. And so to address the point that came up in the questions, the ECLSK is a phenomenal data set in that it's huge, it's nationally representative for the US, but the EF measures leave something to be desired. So looking at later childhood, there is a flanker task. At this point, there is some parent and teacher report of things that we would consider to be executive function measures, things like self-control and inhibition and approaches to learning, but those are not super highly correlated with the kind of behavioral measures of executive function. So for the purposes of this, I'm only using working memory. I have run these same models with the DCCS, which is our metric of cognitive flexibility, and there's no such associations there. I definitely recommend looking at, there's a paper by Mike Willoughby and Michael Little and one other person using this parallel process growth model with structured residuals, or cross-leg panel model with structured residuals, where they test those two separately, the DCCS and the working memory measure. And they similarly don't find associations for particularly the DCCS. So lots of interesting kind of implications for whether we think about the executive function as being a set of correlated skills, or whether it's more important to think about one particular set of skills. Obviously, the numbers reverse task uses numbers as a part of the paradigm. But I just wanted to close with this other well-known adage that in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, there is. So it's important to think about the theories that we're bringing to this and what we allow those theories to bring to the modeling approaches that we use, because we might be making substantially different conclusions, which can have implications for educational practice, simply based on the number of data points we collect and the set of models that we're using to report our data out. So thank you so much. I still list my Twitter handle. I know we're all on a max exodus of Twitter, so if anyone wants to convince me to use Mastodon or something else, now's the time.
Great, thank you, Andy. We have some questions in the chat. So actually, maybe I'll ask you to stop sharing your screen for a minute. And Gaia, do you want to ask your question to Andy?
Oh, hello. Hi, Andy.
Hi, Gaia.
Hello. So that's a really enjoyable talk. And which question, Rebecca, would you like me to ask?
Oh, yeah. So but actually, the first one was about the context. So for those.
Oh, yeah. So thank you.
What kind of activities are going on in kindergarten that might build EFs?
So I asked that question because I am really ignorant about what the context of K and year one are like in. Is it grade one? Grade one. I like when it comes to potentially EF enhancing activities, maybe in the context of maths, but also more broadly, if one is thinking about bidirectional relationships and ones that might change over time. Is there something really interesting that's going on that's different earlier in that wave from K onwards that might enhance EF, or that in turn good EF might enhance maths in different ways because of the context? I just don't know what your preschoolers do, basically, or your kindergartens do.
Yeah, so I think the way that I see it, this has more to do with the mathematical skills that kids are learning and the role of executive function in kind of thinking about what else might be at play, what versus what is automatized by children at this particular age point, that the strength of the relation between executive function and math would be stronger, and has less to do with what might be happening in the classroom that's supporting the development of either EF or math. So what so just for a little bit of context, there is certainly some amount of play-based learning in kindergarten, grade one, but overall, I would say that in the US context, there tends to be a little bit more of kind of the what we think about as academic pushdown, where kids are increasingly being asked to sit still, listen to instructions, and benefit from kind of what we think of as direct instruction at increasingly early ages. So in that sense, it might be benefiting students to have those better executive function skills, to learn from the type of instruction that's being given to them. Whether that is the type of instruction that we should be giving to them, I think we probably are going to largely fall on the side of probably not. It would be great to kind of restructure instruction so that kids are better able to learn through doing rather than learn through listening. But I'm not a kindergarten teacher. I'm not adhering to any number of tests that my district or state expects me to put in place. But that said, I think that there's a kind of unique position of very early elementary grades when children are really learning a lot in math, and there's a lot more room for growth as children start to understand quantity and cardinality. That obviously has a huge role in the development of mathematical, how we measure mathematical skills specifically. So thinking about things like measuring operations versus once we get to things like fraction learning, it obviously I think requires a lot more cognitive resources, but are not necessarily something that we can capture based on the types of assessments that we're giving, because it's a narrower set of skills that we're assessing. So when I say that the strength of the relation is stronger in earlier grades, it might just be an artifact of the assessment itself and not of differential learning. I also wanted to quickly address, I definitely agree with what Joanne said here. This is more accurately the relations between working memory and math, which I think Dana will touch on in her presentation up next.
Yeah, there are a few other related questions, Andy, about kind of why you think you might have seen the relations for working memory and not cognitive flexibility.
Yep. Yeah, so looking at some of the past work that I've done, which I'm gonna cite, not saying that others haven't also looked at it, of the different approaches to, or the different components of executive function in math, we only really start to see, so looking at different components of mathematical thinking and different components of executive function, we see that there's a stronger relation for measurements of inhibitory control and working memory on mathematical skills than cognitive flexibility. And that is largely driven by, or the time that that cognitive flexibility seems to come online is when children start thinking about arithmetic operations. So not things like understanding number sense, geometry and patterning, data analysis and statistics, things that we've commonly assessed in early childhood mathematics. But as children start to need to be able to flexibly shift between multiple representations and kind of work with different operations, that's when we start to see an association for cognitive flexibility specifically. So it's possible that as children's working memory load increases, kind of that span aspect, we might see that the relative association with working memory decreases and the role of cognitive flexibility increases, particularly as kids are learning things like fractions. But that is beyond what I can say based on the data.
There are a few questions to asking about the role of language. Did you model language in any of your?
So I control for language at the start of kindergarten as assessment that students have received, just making sure that children are understanding to similar extents, but I didn't model language in here. And I think that would be an important next step. I'm
mindful of time. I want to save some of these broader questions for the end, but just one quick question that actually relates to all the speakers from James. Is wondering about individual differences. So could there be between person variability in whether math or EF tends to boost the other, or whether they're just sort of a highly correlated cluster of skills? What are your thoughts on that for any speaker, actually? Yeah,
awesome question. I'd love to know the answer.
There are also, actually, I'm going to flag these for the speakers to come back to, questions about which sorts of EF interventions are effective, and what the role of social and emotional factors are specifically when thinking about motivation to learn in math education. So things that we'll come back to, but this is a good point, I think, for Dana to set up her talk. Oh, and Andy, Emma Blakey was asking about SES modeling and the ECLSK data, so maybe you can follow up with her on that. All right, so I'll turn it over to Dana.
Sorry, couldn't find my unmute. Thank you, Rebecca. So this is great because Andy really set up a lot of what I'm going to talk about in my talk. So I'll be talking about different modeling strategies that we used as well, trying to test competing theories of particularly working memory, but executive function more broadly as it relates to math learning difficulty. So attempting to get at some of these individual differences that came up in the discussion. So I like to always put things into context. I think many of us here are really interested in this math context and why some children study or struggle in math and why others seem to have a lot of success, right? So particularly in the United States, we see that children in the 4th grade, the overwhelming majority lack proficiency in mathematics. And so by the time they get to 8th grade, that proficiency drops, and that's evidenced by our National Assessment of Education Progress. Excuse me. And so much of my work has looked at a number of early predictors that predict math outcomes, particularly between the ages of kindergarten to 3rd grade. And so one of the reasons that we've come across or we've come upon executive functions as being something that we find really fascinating is because, as we've discussed throughout this discussion, executive functions is strongly predictive of later math outcomes. And as some of Andy's work has suggested, executive function serves as a support for efficiently learning mathematics. And so I won't go through too much detail about what executive functions are because Andy and Rebecca have kindly talked about that already and covered that. But what I will say is working memory is one of the 2 variables in this data set. It's also one of the oldest studied components of executive function and often demonstrates the most predictability of early mathematics skills. And so this is the one I'll be focusing on in much of the 2 studies that I'll be presenting today. And so from early work, we know that a relatively recent meta-analysis that math and working memory are correlated at about 0.35. This is meta-analysis from Dr. Pong Pong at UT Austin. And so a lot of the theoretical or the why behind why working memory and math performance are correlated is because this belief that, well, challenges in mathematics also are comorbid with challenges in executive function or working memory more specifically. And so children who demonstrate these challenges in mathematics or extreme challenges in mathematics often demonstrate remarkable challenges on these executive function tasks, in particular working memory. And so the line of research or the studies that I'll be presenting on try to get at or test these theories with different modeling approaches. And so there's 3 broader umbrella theories that we attempted to test in this line of work. And so the first subset of theories is what we call the cognitive filter subset of theories. And so these theories articulate that the reason math and working memory are so highly correlated is because working memory is working as this filter, really because only a subset of information can be processed at a given time. And so children who are learning math can only take in a limited amount of information. And so we would expect that math at a given time point would kind of be filtered through working memory at that same time point to go on to predict later math. And of course, earlier math or prior knowledge rather predicts later math skills, and the same for working memory. And so the second subset of theories that we term the positive manifold suggests that the reason working memory and math skills are correlated is because they must share this underlying common factor. Some people believe that's G. Some people believe it could be strategies. But the reality is these are correlated factors. And so we might think that because if math and working memory are so highly correlated, then we would continue to see these concurrent paths between math and working memory. So both math and working memory are predicting each other at later time points. And then finally, this third subset of theories is what we call these transactional models. It's also termed this bidirectional mutualism relations between math and working memory. And so this subset of theory suggests that it's not only that working memory tasks or working memory allows people to manipulate and manipulate and attend to information in mind, but it's also this ability to retrieve information from memory. And so we would expect that these would demonstrate that math and working memory are working together to pull this information from memory, but also math, excuse me, is working together with working memory to be efficient in pulling this information. And so we set out to test these theories through a number of studies. And using the same data set that Andy just presented on, the early childhood longitudinal study, for this data set, children were assessed for this only kindergarten, first grade, and second grade, the spring of each. And so we looked at working memory and math performance more specifically. Some additional information that deviates a little bit from Andy's presentation. So I won't go over a numbers reverse digit span, but one thing to know about the math assessment in this data set is children at this time frame are being exposed to number sense properties and operations. And so these are consistent with what they would typically see in the US around this time. And so these are the portion of items that they were exposed to for this assessment. And so what we found when comparing across these three theories, consistent with Andy's presentation, is that this bidirectional relations was what fit the data the best. And so we see that this is the data that fits the model, the model that fits the data the best. And so examining a little further, we see that for both math and working memory, later scores are predicted both directly by early prior knowledge or earlier scores in the domain, and indirectly is one ability through the other ability. So math at time one is or for first grade is mediating working memory's influence on working memory at time two is mediated by math. So in other words, this is a bidirectional relationship. When examining these coefficients more deeply, we can see that the magnitudes of these relationships between math and working memory are significant, but they appear to decrease, although we didn't actually test that at the time of this study. And so a couple of things to keep in mind is that, again, this bidirectional relationship has been seen before, and again, we see it here in these data. And so this might suggest that, or expertise models rather, would suggest that individuals with this high working memory capacity can offload information to long-term memory as a way of keeping track of information and to more efficiently learn while learning math. And so this may give us some insights on why some students demonstrate math learning difficulties, because they may have trouble keeping this information in mind. Again, we didn't test that specifically. Some other considerations with this data set is that there's only one working memory measure, as Andy mentioned. So it's a great data set because it allows us to look at a lot of students across various time points, but there's only one working memory measure. And again, it is a numerical working memory measure. And so we really can't tease out what might be driving these relationships. The other thing I'll mention is that we have a composite math measure in this data set. And so we really can't tease out, well, how would this relationship differ between different mathematical domains? How would the relationship differ between working memory and patterns, or working memory and operations, or number sense? And so one, of course, limitation for this study was that, consistent with what Andy was describing, is that these types of modeling approaches don't allow us to really differentiate between this between person and within person difference in estimating these relationships. And so as a follow-up study, what we did was set out to test how would these relations differ, again, looking at different modeling approaches, how would these relationships differ if looking at simply the within person differences, teasing out those differences. We also set out to see if these relationships differed if looking at both working memory and cognitive flexibility, which was assessed using the DCCS. Lastly, we were interested in seeing statistically testing if these relationships did in fact decrease over time. Does the relationship between working memory and math decrease between kindergarten? We went up to 5th grade this time, as well as for cognitive flexibility. And so I won't go over this too much because Andy's talked about this at length. But we set out to test four models, simply trying to build on each of these models to see if the fit progressively improved. And again, we were able to replicate prior findings that these bidirectional relationships or bidirectional paths were best fit the data. This was the case for both working memory and cognitive flexibility, which we didn't have any prior a priori hypotheses about how cognitive flexibility might relate to math skills over time. And again, these paths are, or these time points are from kindergarten this time up to 5th grade. And so in statistically testing whether or not these relationships decreased over time, so decreased between kindergarten and 5th grade, what we did was the coefficients on the left-hand side are for working memory and math, and for on the right-hand side, math and cognitive flexibility. So we examined these relationships between working memory and math and cognitive flexibility over time to see if they decreased, similar to the conversation we just had. And so what we saw was that there was a similar pattern in the other direction, where math achievement at prior time points significantly predicted working memory at later time points when controlling for previous working memory. And so this held for all waves of the data. What is particularly striking, we thought, was the coefficients for cognitive flexibility to math and from math to cognitive flexibility also demonstrated that there might be less of a decrease relative to working memory. So this might be pretty consistent with what Andy was saying, and what we've seen in other studies is that working memory is pretty helpful when kids are learning these early math concepts, whereas cognitive flexibility may start to ramp up or be more important as kids learn to start to learn more complicated math skills. And so what this might tell us is that increasing executive function might lead to better math achievement at later time points, and the same math leading to better executive functions, potentially because children have more opportunities to practice these complicated steps and different operations that might overlap with what we're asking them to do in these assessments. We also see that executive function may develop in this reciprocal manner when we are controlling for these what's called unobserved time invariant confounders, like SES and et cetera. And we also see that these relationships tend to decrease as children age, particularly for working memory. And so this one thing that we've been assuming, I think, with this line of work is we tend to think of the relations between working memory and math as being, well, they exist potentially because of children with math learning difficulties, right? The assumptions always go back to children with math learning difficulties. And so we figured, because we had the data and we could potentially create a variable approximating math learning difficulty, why not actually test this to see? And so some of this is still preliminary. There are a number of more analyses we would love to run with these data to determine how the relations differ, what the individual differences are for executive function and math skills. So I'll present some of them now. So in particular, we were interested in what's the longitudinal relationship between executive functions and math skills, again, from kindergarten to 5th grade, and does this relationship differ when comparing children with math learning difficulties and non-MLD or non-math difficulty children. And so for the purposes of this presentation and consistent with prior work, math learning difficulty was defined as a child demonstrating below 35% proficiency in the kindergarten math assessment during the fall cohort. In our data set, we define MLD status as a binary variable. And so for the purposes of this presentation, that will be how we continue to define it. But we also took into account the potential of using the IEP variable in the data set and how that might work to better define it. And this definition, as I'm presenting here again, is consistent with work from Paul Morgan and others using the same data set. Oh, my slides don't want to go forward. Okay, so for our first part of our question, again, these preliminary analyses are suggesting that these bidirectional relationships, again, are fitting. The model fit indicators suggested that the bidirectional relationship do fit the data similarly with what we've seen. Again, this one being only for children with math learning difficulties. And so then we tested whether the models for children with math learning difficulties and without were different. And so first what we did was do a multi-group analysis using the same approach to see if the fit would differ. And so our chi-square difference test suggests that there is indeed a difference between children with math learning difficulty and those without. But follow-up analyses are still needed to determine the extent to which these patterns differ. Primarily, what do these paths look like? What are the coefficients? And then the second step being, is there a degree of severity of these math learning difficulties to determine the relations between working memory and, or particularly executive functions and math skills. So these relationships, in particular for the presentation or the variables I just mentioned, appear to be different. So hopefully our Fowler analyses will offer more light on how these relationships differ, particularly for this given population. And with that, I'll just take an opportunity to thank my collaborators and take questions.
Great, thanks, Dana. Lots of great questions. First, importantly, how do you measure math learning difficulty?
Excellent question. So what we did was just a really quick overview of the ECLSK data set. So children are assessed during the fall and spring on many of the variables, some of them not both time points. For our purposes for math learning difficulty, we use the fall and the spring math skills. So if they they performed at the 35% or below for math proficiency. And we did that primarily because we didn't want the variable to mess up any estimates that would be highly correlated with their math skills at every other time point. So we just used for kindergarten. Some work, I will say, using the same data set suggests using not only the math performance on the math measure, but also having an IEP. And we've played around with that idea a little bit, only because of the importance, but also we worried a little bit that students with the math, an IEP might have distinct math learning disabilities, and we were trying to differentiate between those groups.
And then relatedly, is there a way of looking at different subgroups within those kids, so that some that might have an MLD in kindergarten, but then don't later meet the criterion by 5th grade, for example? So in other words, we're looking at like sort of protective factors against math learning difficulty?
That is definitely a great question. So we have thought about that. I don't think we've gotten to the point yet of figuring out how to model that. So I would definitely take suggestions on how to do that. I know Andy and I have talked about that and thought about that a little bit.
There's also lots of great discussion in the chat about, again, working memory and how is it different from EF? What's the relationship with EF? And if you don't mind, Rebecca Gordon, I'm going to put you on the spot. I want you to elaborate on your spicy take that working memory might actually be the umbrella skill.
Thank you. I was here, like, keeping my mouth shut, thinking it's not your talk, Rebecca. Yes, I mean, as Dana knows, because she responded to me in the chat, and it's my experience, and I know when you look at the work of Van der Sluis and that group of researchers, that when you look at predictors of mathematics, you may find that there are relationships between inhibition and task switching, cognitive flexibility, but when you put working memory into the model, it swallows up all that variance. Yeah. And to my mind, that makes perfect sense, because even though I know there are different schools of thought in terms of where you come at executive function, I do think that it makes sense if working memory is the umbrella term, because for working memory to work effectively, you are filtering out irrelevant information, you're inhibiting yourself from responding to information that is irrelevant, you're switching your attention to different elements of the task, and in order to maintain relevant information and process it, and also retrieving information from long-term memory, in pursuit of the known goal. For me, I mean, I know this is going back to the Baddeley and Hitch central executive, but to me, it makes sense that working memory is the umbrella term rather than executive function. But as you say, it's a spicy take, Rebecca.
We like spicy takes.
I'd like to hear anybody's feedback, opinion on that.
Gaia.
I was going to say I'd like to hear Gaia's feedback on that, but I didn't want to say.
I mean, of course, I love you. I don't know if you can hear me well, Rebecca. I mean, I'm with you in that I love working memories of maintenance. So I would want to support you in putting it forward as the umbrella skill. But this is actually, I need to credit Camilla Gilmore for raising this point in a separate conference. perhaps we need to go back to something that Andy had also mentioned, and Dana as well, which it remains quite critical to think of what the outcome mathematical skill is that we are measuring, in that it's quite possible that it's true. Working memory maintenance is an umbrella term that works really well for certain mathematical skills and outcomes. But for others, the element of building on a hierarchy and or flexibly shifting away from something you've just learned may be more relevant or equally relevant. And so Camilla was saying, well, is it also the hierarchical nature of the skills that children learn over time and how that changes? That might be a reason why you see those relationships also with cognitive flexibility, not only with working memory. So maybe that's I'm trying to be Camilla and she's way smarter, so I don't know, but that would, I think that might have been her response.
Thank you.
We have
Sorry,
a
I'll
hand
hand
up.
back to you.
Do you want to ask your question?
Hi, I'm Sucheta, and I had two questions. One, I think, was an interesting comment about that early years in learning and math relationship is more in favor of working memory playing a larger role. And as mathematical skills get rooted, the foundational mathematical skills, and you start doing more complex math, you need more cognitive flexibility to hypothesize, to test out one solution, discard it, then apply another rule. So I was wondering if is this the conversation more centered toward elementary math? Because what happens to these mathematical abilities in middle and high school ages? And my second question was more about the general strategic thinking and math. So, you know, one of the strongest skill set and executive function skill is to be able to strategize based on knowledge or meta knowledge that I'm struggling, or I think I'm not doing well. So is there any data, or are you familiar with how to teach children to recognize breakdown in their mathematical thinking? Because that is one of the strongest ways to really circumvent the problem of working memory, is to have strategic thought. But I didn't hear anybody talk about that, so I was just curious.
I can jump in and say really two brief things that I thought of. So yes, the focus is on early childhood. I don't know that we have many folks that I know that study executive function into middle childhood. I know there's a number of projects funded by the EF Plus math program studying middle childhood, going into middle childhood and executive function in math. So I imagine there would be a lot of work in the coming years to tell us a little more about that. In terms of what you're saying in terms of strategies or thinking, kind of being more reflective, it sounds a little bit about metacognition. And so Christina Barbieri at the University of Delaware has been thinking a lot about having students reflect on their errors during math, particularly when learning early algebra concepts. And so some of the work that she's been thinking about is also to what extent does executive function either help or interfere with this deep reflection. So I think the work is coming. It's just we don't have a firm answer yet.
Yeah, I also want to mention a quick cautionary tale about using other significant other report of behavioral control or inhibitory control or any self-regulatory skills, because oftentimes we see that the child who's struggling but not speaking up is highly rated as a learner and having great skills that enable them to be a good student in a classroom. But oftentimes that's because they're not speaking up because they don't want to cause trouble or be this center of attention. And so we actually see kind of a quadratic function of this idea of approaches to learning and mathematical skill development, where if children are too highly rated, they actually see a negative association with mathematical skill learning, because I think because they're over inhibiting in a classroom context.
And there's lots of great discussion in the chat about the taxonomy of EFs. And then I want to come back to you after Caylee's talk, but in particular, I wanted to flag, Gary mentioned the idea of hot and cool EFs, which I think relates to earlier questions about motivation, which is something we haven't really touched on so far. So keeping in mind to come back to, and how looking at more of these sort of self-regulatory or motivational factors might change these relationships. Rebecca also asked, Dana, do you have any comments on the working memory take?
Oh, sorry, I wasn't sure if I was still muted. I think one of the things I struggle with a little bit is the historical. So because working memory is such an older, I think in some ways than the other constructs, it's hard to think about or disentangle where does working memory end and the others begin. But I'd be super curious or love to have a thought exercise on how we could test whether that is the actual umbrella term. And I wouldn't even know. Maybe Andy has some sense of how we would test that. But I do agree. I do think that part of the problem that we run into so much with the assessment and the definition is that we keep bumping up again, particularly inhibitory control and cognitive flexibility. We're bumping up, we're kind of like heading into working memory territory. And it's because of exactly your point that working memory is actually the umbrella.
Thank you. Thanks.
Emma, do you want to ask your question? It's long, I don't want to read it out. For Dana.
Hi everybody. I'm on maternity leave, so I've got a toddler running around like crazy, and so sorry if it's really noisy in here. Thanks, Dana. It was really interesting. So I was wondering, I think there's been a lot of research now suggesting that executive function supports maths, and the talks have been really great in talking about the possible ways that might work. And I guess this idea that there's a bi-directional relationship between those things has sort of emerged really recently. And I'm really interested in your thoughts on why that might be, and whether, as you mentioned, is this possibly to do with some third factor like language, or just the nature of maths tasks, or do we just not know yet? I feel like
I'm really enjoying this part. Sorry. I don't know if I have a good answer for that. I feel like the I don't know yet is probably the right direction. I think some of the things that I think that at least the argument that I've been sticking to why math might be having some association with earlier working memory in particular is this opportunity to sort of practice operations and skills that mirror not necessarily what working memory actually is, but what we're asking kids to do on working memory tasks. I think that might be the closest thing. Now, again, it's not necessarily because working memory maybe it's a thing, maybe it's not, I don't know, right? But at the same time, like the things that we're asking kids to do on these tasks, which is really limited again for like this data set. And I think generally many of us use the same working memory tasks over and over. So the sort of directions that we're asking kids to do, or the strategies that we're asking them to use on these tasks, look very similar to the things that we're asking kids to do in their math classes. And so potentially, is it the doing or the learning? That's a great point too, Gaia. And so some of that might just be more opportunities to practice those sort of operations or those skills in math class. But is it the doing or the learning? My question for Andy is, how do we differentiate the two on an assessment? Or how do we observe it, I guess? What makes it observable? The distinctions between the two.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think from an assessment standpoint, it's less of an assessment question and more of a design question. But I am looking forward to figuring that out. I think with regard to that, I think we often think about executive function as a domain general skill. And I think probably what we are finding and or going to find is that there's a lot more domain specificity to the practice of using executive function in classroom contexts, particularly for thinking about the role of EF in math and EF in other things. And I think it doesn't really boil down to a simple distinction between hot and cold EF. But I think that there's also a role for automaticity. The more that children practice a set of mathematical skills, the fewer cognitive resources they need to recruit in order to solve those same types of problems or use those same skills. So I don't know if that's necessarily bolstering executive function or allowing for a greater availability of executive function resources for other tasks.
I've been asked to share in the chat a paper engaging the sort of taxonomy discussion as well, looking at how task demands might affect how we think of EF. I want to move on to Caylee's talk because we don't run out of time. And then we can come back hopefully afterwards to some of these great discussions about the nuances of these relationships.
Thanks, Rebecca. Kind of just to add to that conversation about the kind of, if you're testing working memory, but you're actually designing it to look like maths, that's one of the struggles we've had with adapting tools for low and middle income settings, particularly settings in poverty where children haven't learned math skills yet, but we want to measure the executive function. So even things like a digit span task actually doesn't work in our settings because we're relying on number knowledge, which they don't have. So we really aim to kind of focus purely on executive function and try to remove any sort of school-related skills or skills that they would need to rely on to perform these executive function tasks. So just my input to the conversation. Let me just share. Okay, can everyone see? Very good.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm actually not a numeracy or math person. Rebecca and Gaia have been brought into our projects for that specific reason. But what I am passionate about is the context and considering diversity and how these things that we just take from high income settings or minority world settings and how they apply to majority world settings. So this presentation is going to be a bit of a mismatch. So talking about EF and numeracy, like we said, but also something about the home learning environment, which those of you who were at MCLS or IMBES might see some repeats from me, but also other considerations for measuring these types of things in diverse settings. Let me just get it going. Go next. So as we always need to do when we're talking about diverse settings is to give a bit of background and contextual information so that you can understand really the sample that we're working with here. So looking at South Africa, 56% of South African children live underneath the poverty line. It's, yeah, $1 is 17 Rand here. Most children live with a family, the households live with under $98 per month. Which is very, very low. 66% of South African children aged 3 to 5 years have no access to any early childcare and education. And kind of taking from that, we know that the majority of children in South Africa are at risk. But what do we do about that? So we've set out a few projects to really try and investigate both the risk and protective factors for early childhood cognition and learning in some of South Africa's most vulnerable children. But as you all discussing these things about how do we measure, what do we measure, obviously those questions are even more complicated when you're trying to do that in a setting that is so under-researched and so misunderstood or not yet understood. It adds a whole level of complexity as well. So this discussion has been really great so far. So I think kind of after this talk, it'd be great to just talk about some of that too. So a little bit more background. If you look at the current literature, known risk factors for early childhood cognition and development are things like poverty, stresses, limited educational resources, limited opportunities for learning, lack of adequate nutrition. And as you saw from the stats about South Africa, many South African low-income children fit all of those. However, there's known protective factors such as access to early childhood education and care, which the majority of children do not have in South Africa. Higher parental education, that's not a given in South Africa either. Responsive caregiving and nurturing care, stimulating home environment. Those are all the things that are really focused on when you look at the literature for developing early childhood cognition. And it's really, a lot of these aren't a reality in our settings. So children in low-income settings in South Africa face numerous risks to their early learning and development, but recent research and ongoing research continues to find strong executive function abilities despite children's low-income status. I'll speak a bit more about that after this, and we could probably have a whole other symposium on that as well. So this really challenges how we understand EF development, and that we really need to look through more than just a westernized lens when we're starting to try and unpack executive function in these settings. So this is our paper, our manuscript that was out on challenging socioeconomic status, a cross-cultural comparison of early executive function, where we actually took an opportunity to compare executive function in an Australian sample, a preschool age sample, and a South African low-income preschool age sample, where we had high income and low income. And what we actually found was that South African children outperformed Australian children in every single task. And even to the point that the lowest income South African child performed better than the highest income Australian child. So go read the paper if you want to know more about that, or pop me an email. I'd be happy to chat. So since that finding, we've really been starting to think about kind of why might we be seeing this? Why might this gradient actually look different? And possible explanations for high executive function in South African children that we've been thinking about. None of this has been proven scientifically, but we're really trying to think about how we can use research to gain insight into these. But some of the things we've been thinking about are things like children being involved in routines and rituals, big families, high number of siblings, in which case they have to learn to share, to wait their turn, etc. Many children have meaningful roles and responsibilities in the home. There's also a really high risk of not being alert. If you're playing in the streets and your mom says you have to be home by 5, if you're not home by 5, it gets dangerous outside, and that's a risk to you. As well as spending time with children of different ages. They just play outside in their neighborhoods. Much of the time it's within different age groups. You're not sort of in an ECD center in your age group class, you're just out in the neighborhood. More creativity because of less access to manufactured toys and iPads. As well as compliance with instructions. Obedience is something that's really valued as a skill in this culture. And so compliance when conducting tests or doing tests is really important. As well as recent interviews with children, actually, we found that these children who have no access to ECD centers actually have complete autonomy over their day for the most part. We asked them what their ideal day looks like, and they pretty much said what they do every day is their ideal day, which is go out and play with their friends, maybe watch some TV, but yeah, very little structure involved and a lot of autonomy in their day. So we can chat more about that later as well. But for the current study, we recruited through our partner NGO who works with over 8,000 families within the Western Cape. We recruited from 4 different low-income communities. These communities had high rates of food insecurity, unemployment, crime and violence, substance abuse, and overcrowding. Actually, during COVID, our unemployment rate went over 50% of the country unemployed, just to put that into perspective. So again, just some contextual background of what the homes of some of these children might look like within these settings. I always find it important to show these, so there's contextual understanding. I'm not going to go through this, but this was the full project. We tested children and interviewed their caregiver, time 1, and then was meant to be a year later. COVID made that 7 months later, and we tested them again. Many of the things we did at time 1 and time 2, including executive function, as well as some numeracy tasks, which we'll get into. So I know this is a symposium on EF and math, but as I said, I think the home learning environment was quite an interesting part of this for me. And I know at MCLS, there was a lot of talk about the home learning environment, and particularly that measuring that in majority world or non-weird settings was actually really difficult. So I thought I'd just present what we had and also have it as a point for discussion. But as we know, a wide range of settings have shown that the home learning environment is really important for the development of academic skills, including, and very importantly, numeracy. Opportunities for learning in young children really need to first be created in the home, and even more so if these children are not going to any sort of ECD center. So the aim of this study was to explore the relationship between the home learning environment and numeracy skills in these children within Cape Town, South Africa. We measured resources they had in the home. We asked a questionnaire about home learning activities that the parent or caregiver did with the child. We also asked about household income and parental education. So this was just time one. We haven't, well, Rebecca and Guy are busy looking into all of that at the moment. But what I'm going to present to you is just time one, so cross-sectional relationships between the home learning environment and numeracy. What we found with resources in the home, that there were some toys and books in the home. Toys were things like cars, dolls, teddy bears. Books, 31% reported that there weren't any books in the home. Those that did report that there were books, there was an average of about 3 per household, all of which could count the amount of books that were in their house. Those of you with toddlers and young children probably have too many books to count, or have gone through many books. So just as a comparison, these families could actually count the number of books. We didn't even specify child-friendly books. We just asked for books. Then time available to spend with the child, we asked as well. In the week, we found that it was pretty spread. Many of these parents were actually unemployed. So the fact that almost 40% of them said they have very little time was interesting. On weekends, they seem to have even less time to spend with the children, but considering the responsibilities within the community and the household, that made sense. So this was the home learning environment, or the activities that we asked. So we asked for a frequency of home learning activities. We asked about reading books or picture books, telling stories, singing songs, taking the child outside the home, playing with the child, telling the child the name of things, counting things, and drawing or painting things. And the orange bar is never, and the yellow bar is many times. So interestingly, you can see that when it comes to reading books or painting and drawing things, those were the two that people said that they never did. And when you think about it, those are the things that really require resources. They require books, or they require paint or crayons, whereas the activities in the middle, like singing songs, playing with the child, telling the child the name of things, were quite, there was a high frequency of these types of activities. So just basic correlations to look at the home learning environment and these numeracy skills. So the numeracy skills are in the orange square at the bottom there. We see a correlation with age, which was great. And in fact, the only home learning environment factor that we saw a correlation with was toys in the household, and it was actually negatively correlated. So we really found almost nothing when it comes to home learning environment. So just some limitations. We know that we didn't focus specifically on home numeracy activities, but when it comes to working in these settings, you have to be really sensitive about what you ask. If you're asking the caregiver, do you play math games with your child? You might make them feel like they're incapable and they can't provide for their child, and you might make them feel bad. So the tool that we took was a tool that was designed in South Africa for low resource settings. So when it comes to asking these types of questions, you have to think a level above about how the caregiver or the family will feel about those types of questions, more than just what information do you want to get out of the families. So perhaps in these settings, we really do need to think about how we capture the home learning environment in these complex settings. We've come to believe that qualitative data and qualitative interviews might be better to capture what happens in these complex settings, as well as I mentioned, the need to really be sensitive to the situation and the fact that a nuclear family unit just does not apply in these settings, which the majority of tools and measures and questionnaires are designed for or around. Again, this is time one data. We may start to see individual differences over time. So just to conclude on that part, we know that there's a challenging home environment with limited resources, low, poor caregiver education, high levels of stress and violence, and a lack of potentially caregiver capacity. But positively, there are many activities that are happening, like singing songs and telling stories. These may not be impacting the numeracy skills directly, but they may still have other positive outcomes. And there's the possibility to leverage those low resource activities for numeracy development within these settings. So where next when we're thinking about this type of thing in these settings is to acknowledge that these are complex and multi-layered, and that in fact, qualitative research or mixed methods and local input is needed to better understand and capture what's happening in these households. This is a quick example of something that we based on this time one data, one of, I think Rebecca was your student, that helped us design a really fun representative infographic for just really quick and easy activities that a caregiver can do with their child without the need for resources, to show them that they really can practice numeracy skills anywhere at any time with their children. And we printed this and sent it out to the NGO that we worked with. So onto the EF and numeracy. We wanted to look at the relationship between executive function and numeracy, or mathematical development, same as what everyone's been talking about. So in these settings, to be more specific about our sample, we had 243 child and caregiver pairs. 70% of them were the mother. 82% of them had no post-school education. And in fact, only a quarter of them finished high school. These children were between the ages of 3 to 5 years, as I said, not attending ECD, and we collected data at 2 time points. So numeracy, we measured using a number counting task, a number identification task, both of which were only done at time 1. And then we did a give n task for cardinality, which was done at time 1 and time 2. And then IDELA, the International Development and Early Learning Assessment from Save the Children, we used to measure their early learning skills, and we used the numeracy component of that in these models. And then for executive function, we used the early years toolbox, which has a go, no go task for inhibition, a card sorting task for cognitive flexibility, and a short-term memory, a visual spatial short-term memory task for called Mr. And for working memory. As I mentioned before, we've actually found that the early years toolbox is really great because it does not rely too heavily on prior knowledge, and that these children actually really love the tasks and they tend to do quite well at them. So what did we analyze? Well, we wanted to find out what the numeracy profiles were of these vulnerable children in South Africa. We wanted to know, does early executive function predict later numeracy? Does early executive function predict change in numeracy? And does early numeracy predict later numeracy? This is still very preliminary work. Gaia helped us with this, and Rebecca is actually currently busy looking more into the data as well. So this is quite preliminary for now. So we're just looking at some simple bivariate correlations and hierarchical regressions controlling for time 1 numeracy or time 1 executive function. So the results of the give n, this was time 1. So we found that, as you can see, only 71% of the children were not CP knowers at time 1. So most of them couldn't give us 8 sticks when we were asking for 8 sticks, which is pretty low considering the mean age of the children. By this point, you would expect them to be a CP knower. But you can see in the give n section on the right-hand side that you do see an improvement from time 1 to time 2, even given the 7-month time period. We do see that children, more children would have indeed become CP knowers in that time. And then just a quick graph of the IDELA percent scores. So this is obviously between 0 and 100. The red dot is the average, so just over 50%, but quite a big spread across the percentages, with many children performing below 50, and in fact, quite a few children performing above 50, but still quite a big spread, and many children being in the lower percentages as well. So in terms of executive function and numeracy, and the bivariate correlations showed what we would expect and what we've seen in high income literature, is that time 1 EF was correlated with time 2 numeracy, time 1 EF is correlated with time 2 EF, they're all correlated strongly. And then in terms of the hierarchical regressions, we did find that time 1 executive function predicted time 2 executive function, and that time 1 numeracy predicted time 2 numeracy, and then it did go both ways as well. So this was just a graph presenting time 1 EF factor with time 2 numeracy factor, so you see a relationship there as well. And then I'm actually going to hand over to Rebecca for this one.
Okay, thanks, Caylee. So this is super preliminary. But as Caylee mentioned, we recruited children at the first time point who were not attending early childhood care and education at the time. But sort of this opportunity happened where by the second time point, some of these children had started attending some kind of early childhood care and education. So this is quasi-experimental. And of course, it's confounded with age. But what I've done here is to sort of try to look at the influence of being in school or not across children that are similar age ranges. And we would expect, of course, to find that hopefully kids in school are learning about math, but we've seen from some data in higher income countries, including that ECLSK data, that actually being in school seems to be associated with improvement in executive functions as well. So in this, we have 94 kids who by time 2 were attending some sort of early childhood education in yellow, and then in blue, children that were not yet, or still were not in any kind of early childhood education. And so on average, older children were more likely to be in school, but you can see that we actually do have a nice sort of spread across age ranges. So we have age on the x-axis, and on the left here, we have numeracy on the y-axis. And so when we look at regression models predicting numeracy, we find that being in school or not is a predictor over and above age. And also that actually the working memory measure from time 1 is also predictive of time 2 numeracy over and above age, or when accounting for age of being in school. And we see a similar thing with executive function, but the effect doesn't seem to be as strong, which is consistent with what Caylee's already shown, that these kids, even growing up in these vulnerable settings, seem to have relatively high EFs, despite not having access to formal education.
Cool. Thanks, Rebecca. So just to also put into context, the going to school would be, so when children are 5, they get to start grade R and they can go to a no-fee school. So for many of these families, it's the first time they can send their child to a school because it's now free. So that's what happened with some of these children indeed going to grade R and starting school. But as you can see, the school effect is really, really strong, whereas the EF1 slightly less. So your home numeracy model, our home learning environment, I really don't think we learned very much from that, other than we really need to address how we assess that. But we did replicate the executive function and numeracy relationship, as well as replicating in the sample the strong or capable executive functions of these children. So this is now more what I'm really passionate about, is really the considerations for non-weird or the majority world settings, and doing this type of research within these settings. While it's all good and well to measure everything we want to measure, and these relationships are really important for us, and we want to share it with the rest of the world, and we hope it can do this, we really need to sit down and think what that's actually, is that meaningful for the communities that we're working in and for the environment that we're in. And the things that you need to consider is that there's food insecurity, that hungry children can't learn. So if we came up with this really great numeracy intervention or EF intervention, many of them aren't getting the food that they need in the first place. And so that would be something we'd need to consider. So should we in fact even care about EF in these settings if there's more pressing issues, or within, from what we're finding is that EF is actually already pretty strong, but perhaps there's other early learning skills that we need to be focusing in on to leverage these strong EFs, but maybe they need some more input in other ways. You also really need to consider parents and caregiver capacity, and these need to factor into your considerations for recommendations. So it's all good and well to say that good quality ECD means your child will do better. But there's no point in saying that if there's no ways that these families can access good quality ECD. So you really need to think about those things as well. Additionally, what we found a lot is the belief about the role as a caregiver or parent affects how they believe that their role within their child's early learning. For many people within this country, it's the teacher's job to teach the child, and it's your job to keep the child safe, to feed the child, and get them to school eventually. There's also really high levels of substance abuse, in which case caregivers really aren't going to be amenable to us telling them they need to do these interventions and do early numeracy tasks, as well as particularly in rural settings in South Africa that weren't the settings for this study, but many of the grandmothers who take care of the children don't have any education and are in fact illiterate. So you really need to consider the education barriers for caregivers. Even when children do enter the school system, there's about 50 plus children per class with one teacher. So even if you get the children's numeracy and executive function to a point that they're really set up and ready for school, that's going to help them, because within a class that big, they're going to need that. But will they also eventually get lost? And how can we keep intervening where we need to help these children get through? And then a publication that we've actually just put out about publishing woes for non-weird researchers. I'll share it on the chat with you. But a lot of this research is actually happening in majority world. It's just not being published because we keep running into barriers when it comes to trying to publish the work in high impact journals, biased against things such as continuously asking us to provide more information about the context, more information about the settings, when you've already spent 2 pages talking about the settings, and just saying that it's not applicable to any other, it's only applicable to your sample within South Africa. And so we, as an international journal, we can't publish it, which is opposite to what they do if a study comes from the US. It doesn't matter where it was from. So I'll share that on the chat as well. And then we've actually just recently gone around the country to some focus groups in the field, and we learned some really great things from that experience, and I really wanted to share that here as well. So I spoke a bit about the home learning environment tool, and we really need to consider the translations and adaptations of tools. For an example is the strengths and difficulties questionnaire. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with this. We were trying to use that, and we said to the some of the STQ people and some researchers who've used it a lot that we actually really need to adapt even the English. So obviously we translated it, but the British English actually doesn't work well in South African English, despite being a colony. But we wanted to change it, and they said, no, if you change it, you'll lose. It'll lose. I've forgotten the word. But it then won't be as gold standard as if you just kept the words the same. So we really need to think about sort of a gold standard tool versus a tool that's actually going to measure what we want in the settings that we use them in. Then cultural differences. We've been trying to promote, we've been working in social emotional development a bit as well. And we've really learned that love and care looks very different in different settings. In some settings, love and care is feeding your child and buying them stuff and not giving them hugs and telling them you love them. And that's a normal thing. And considering the needs of the community and the participants over the needs of you as a researcher. When it comes to interventions and recommendations, again, like I said, we can find out all these really cool things, but if it's completely meaningless to the community and you've come in and you've brought up all these things and told them about these things, if it's, again, if it's meaningless to them, we're really just taking from them instead of giving back to them as well. And so we really need to do the opposite of helicopter research by following the lead of successful NGOs and community outreach programs that work within those communities. We've learned the ones that have stayed the longest are indeed the ones who spend years developing trust within the community and proving that they're there for them and proving that they're trying to help them. And so, a 1-year grant to enter into a community to get some data really actually isn't enough. You need to spend a lot of time gaining the trust and really understanding the settings and making sure that our research is mutually beneficial. Then just a few more things, some challenges that we experience in the field in these types of settings is that it never goes according to plan. COVID was actually pretty normal for us. If anything, we were just glad that the rest of the world was experiencing it as well. So we didn't have to explain to funders why we couldn't be collecting data, whereas normally we're running into things like protests, violence, migration. We've got load shedding where our electricity just gets cut all the time, although I've heard it's coming to Europe and the UK. So and then as well as the consideration of diversity within and between communities, just within South Africa, within a 10-kilometer radius, there are 3 communities who are vastly different. So really saying South Africa or saying sub-Saharan Africa or low middle income countries, many of them aren't directly comparable either. And then, as I mentioned before, questions that might seem harmless might be triggering, like, oh, do you play with blocks with your child? Oh, I can't afford blocks, a failure as a parent. You really need to think about those things. And then some lessons. Always have fat in the budget for unforeseen things. If you are doing work or research in areas that are that these types of things can happen, you really need to be able to have that money in the budget to do things. For example, we had an area, our research assistants were going into homes to do testing. One of the areas became far too dangerous for anyone to go in. We had to then hire a venue and pay transport money for these families to come to us rather than us go to them. Had we not had fat in the budget, that wouldn't have been possible. Partner with trusted community stakeholders or NGOs and really nurture that relationship. Give more than just the results of the study, and really consider the power dynamics between the NGO and the researcher. Give your field workers and research assistants agency and ownership over the research. I see far too many times people from Harvard presenting work that was done in Ghana. But I would really want to see the research assistants who actually collected the data also being part of presenting the work. And I'm sure they have a lot of insights in when it comes to interpreting the data and the research as well. Be flexible always, and try to remove the westernized lens as much as possible. So just a shout out to our team and our 3 amazing research assistants who did this study for 2 years, considering a pandemic, community violence, everything you could throw at them. They were absolutely incredible. And then Kathy Draper in the pink t-shirt, who's been my PhD supervisor and PI for the last how many years, and then Stephen Howard from the University of Wollongong, and you all know Rebecca, you've seen her face now, and Gaia as well, who've been working with us on this project. And I always like to end with these pictures because as much as we have issues in South Africa, we're an incredibly beautiful country with incredibly beautiful people. So please come visit. Thank you.
Thanks, Caylee. Good, so we do have some time for discussion. My plan was to sort of ask all of the speakers whether EF should be a target for educational intervention, but I wanted to add on, Sue Gifford asked in the chat earlier, what sort of interventions might be effective. So I'd like to hear each of your thoughts on that.
I think it's a great question. As I'm currently involved in some EF intervention research that I'm not 100% confident in the theoretical models of change, I think we need to do a lot more to understand executive function before we try to intervene on it. We had a lot of conversations about task and construct impurity, whether what we're measuring and what we want to be measuring is something related to attention or executive function or working memory, or whether any of those are separable skills. And I think that to the extent that we are continuing to run interventions, and this echoes a lot of what Caylee was saying, we are making promises that we're not keeping to schools and to teachers and to students by saying that there's all this potential when we're actually taking away from instructional time or opportunities. And I think for me, that means that we need to take a little bit more of a broad approach in thinking about the things that enable learning and less of a kind of mechanistic approach of really kind of our goal being to uncover specific mechanisms that drive these relations, which benefits science but doesn't necessarily benefit a classroom teacher, and really think about what's going to benefit students. And as what I'm guessing based on the first 4 words of Joanne's comment is that early math is a great predictor of math and is a stronger predictor of later math than executive function is. And so why are we trying to intervene on something when we know that there's something else that can better predict the target skill? Yeah, I think we need a lot more conversation amongst ourselves and with teachers, and I think we need a lot more mixed methods research before we can confidently say we have an intervention to improve executive function.
Yeah, I'll jump into, I think we've talked a lot about this, Andy and the other speakers. We've seen from the literature that, executive functions are not a silver bullet, or that we can't improve executive function and expect it automatically to lead to improvements in math. The guy asked some questions in the chat too about, given some of these more nuanced relationships we have talked about today, like whether, as Camilla Gilmore suggested, as you learn different math concepts, the executive function demands change, maybe does knowing more about that sort of change the way we might embed executive function into math instruction? Maybe I'll let Gaia speak to that, trying to justify our own research here a little bit, but also trying to probe the rest of the speakers, like given these complicated relationships, do you think there's any merit in kind of considering the executive function challenges in learning and doing math in the classroom?
I guess our work is mostly out of the classroom, so it doesn't quite mean the same. But I think for us, we keep seeing that, like we've all said, that executive function actually is fostered outside of the classroom really, really well, and that's happening in these children being playing outside. And actually, what they're missing is math instruction to help with their math. So I think, kind of for us, an executive function intervention is not needed, and definitely is not necessarily going to be the thing that helps to develop math or numeracy development.
I want to echo what Caylee said. The things that children do naturally build their skills that I think are really involved in the learning process. The things about navigating relationships with people, with peers, allowing peers and interactions with the world around them to be the things that build and support executive function. And I think that there is a role for adults in that, in guiding some of those relationships and providing examples of how best to kind of use our cognitive resources. But I also think that and again, just back to the question of is intervention useful, I think anything that we as adults and as researchers design to be implemented on and for a child is inherently discounting the perspective of the child.
There's a comment in the chat from Judy. Judy, did you want to unmute and say it?
Well, yes, I'm a little concerned. I think that was a good point Caylee made about the measuring, and when we talk about executive function, what really is executive function? And sometimes in doing research to try to answer these questions, we distill it, the terminology and what we're doing to what it is that we can measure. And then what happens is we end up measuring the relationships between these things that we can measure. And that sometimes leads to misunderstandings by people. Like, are we really talking about executive function? I think Caylee's definition of these children who are functioning well in terms of that environment. Though there are many things in executive function besides, of course, working memory. And I find it a little difficult too to think about working memory, measuring executive function and how it relates to early math by doing something that measures executive function with numbers and number sequence. Being very involved with 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, and 4-year-olds, I can tell you that I have seen 4-year-olds who've been able to remember and repeat the names of dinosaurs or the names of different kinds of birds, as where if they're very interested in it. So motivation has a really big part of the focus a child does, the focus of persistence, and the development of memory. I think memory skills are really important for children. I'm not saying that, but I think we have to be really careful when we say, oh, well, we're looking at the relationship between executive functioning and early math. And that's really not exactly how that would come across to the lay people in the field who are actually having to do activities and make decisions about activities and experiences that they provide to children on a daily basis. And yes, this is very interesting to see the relationship between those two measurements, but I think we have to be very careful how far we take that. So we're not taking bridges too far and putting a neuroscience label on it. And then we have a lot of people jump on board. And, as Andy pointed out, then we have more people doing push down curriculum, et cetera. That's all I wanted to say. Thanks. A very interesting discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Those are really important points. I wanted to flag too in the chat, Sue wrote that she's convinced by Caylee that young kids should be playing outside. And I meant to mention in my background overview too, there are lots of things that improve executive functions, such as physical activity and martial arts and mindfulness, that don't necessarily transfer to math. So I think we do have some idea of how to improve executive function, but some of the nuances of which executive function subcomponents relate to which areas of math kind of boils down to maybe if we want to see transfer, we have to really delve into those specific relationships and engage executive function in the context of learning and doing math. For those of you writing in the chat, actually, if you would like to unmute, feel free to throw a hand up, or if not, I can read your question. Yeah, and I agree with Steph. We don't have the tools to really assess, which comes back to a lot of these questions, right? Does executive function matter for learning math or doing math? And how do we tease those apart from an assessment perspective? If anyone has the answer, I'd love to know.
I think I made a comment, which I think there's such an interplay between three stakeholders when we talk about teaching and learning. So we have developing brain and the child's executive function, which are emergent. Then the adult, which is a teacher, and teachers' ability to adapt to the group behavior, individual behavior, and then the parents or the community. And I find that it's very interesting to see inflexible teachers expecting a lot of flexibility from their and not demonstrating adequate metacognitive awareness of self. And I feel that is not kept in the equation. One of the things I would like to see in teaching and learning change, and maybe there's some science we can incorporate, is that the teachers are required to assess their own executive function skills and use that knowledge to teach that metacognitive awareness that this is hard for me because, and let me show you where I trip. Let me show you 3 mistakes I have made last week. When you do that, only then you're creating a culture where accepting personal faux pas as a part of learning and teaching. But let's not assume that teachers have excellent executive function. Like executive function skills are like gas in the car, right? More you drive, less you have. You need to replenish if you don't have a disability. But anyway, I wanted to throw that in the mix.
Thanks. And I wanted to pick up in the chat, there's some discussion about the sort of barriers of executive function, even as a term, which is something actually Andy, Dana, and I were discussing before jumping on this call. Is, this term, is it useful? Like it means different things to different people, and in some ways exacerbates this research practice gap. As someone pointed out, Kate in the chat, like teachers mean different things than researchers do by executive functions. So how are we supposed to work together?
And it doesn't translate into any other languages. So that's a barrier.
I wanted to make one more comment, if it's okay. I think I texted privately to Caylee, but I did wonder, this idea that, we need more information to publish is a veiled data policing and dismissing culturally diverse populations' needs. And I definitely feel that we have such a Western-centric view of exposure, parenting. I hear so much about, slack or blame placed on parents for not playing with their children when they're literally showing how to hold 3 jobs and wake up at 5 a.m. and make breakfast for your siblings. I mean, all that is completely nullified or ignored, at least in, I'm here in US. So I feel these are the barriers, the structural barriers that we're creating, that we are not publishing rich and vividly exemplifying powerful ways to understand complex ways brain exfoliates itself. So.
We've got a few more minutes. Any last questions or comments?
Yeah, I thought this was all really fascinating, and I'm so grateful for all the time you all take. I'm a graduate student. I'm studying motivation to learn, and I'm interested in the social factors, and so I'm curious. We haven't really talked about that really yet, but just what role other individuals play. And I think most of us would say yes, of course, other people are helpful. Obviously, we want to be supporting teachers. But I'm curious about that, where motivation specifically arises, right? Like, it seems like it's not just positive support, it's not just skills, it's the sense of a relational state with someone, that it matters to them that I do well on this. And I'm just curious if other people have thoughts on this, or research questions you want to ask her.
I think some of the conversations we've been having, at least Andy and I have been having, is motivation with the performance on the assessment themselves, and not necessarily the role of motivation in executive function. So some of the conversations we've had are like considering these contextual things. So for instance, if you are a child who, let's say you come from a really impoverished neighborhood or school, and you're being assessed by someone who appears to have more power in a situation, right? Like how that motivation plays a role in your performance on the task, right? Or even like the understanding of the rules or the directions of the task, and if whether or not you value those directions. For instance, something that comes up a lot of, I have really good friends in sociology, and we talk about reaction time is something that we always tend to include in these tasks. But in some cultures, even cultures within the US, subcultures in the US, reaction time is not something that's valued. So if a teacher asks you a question and you react and have an answer really fast, it's almost looked down upon, because it's like, well, you didn't really think about that fast, right? So it's unfair to ask students in these contexts, I need you to answer this as fast as you can, even though in every other context, I'm telling you not to answer that really quickly, right? So I think less of motivation is like, how does maybe certain motivation, identity, or values predict executive functions, but even just like, what are these motivational pieces that are just determining how a kid will perform on this task, or if they'll understand the rules or take it serious, or even care about the task in general, has been something we've been thinking about a lot.
I think an important thing too is, in response to that motivation, is how much interest a child has in it, and the fact that we have paying attention to children's ideas and responding to them, and listening to what they have to say, and making that back and forth interaction, which I think happens in many cultures. That's not tested, but that being responsive to what children are interested in. I know we've seen quite a few things came up here about Montessori and some other areas, and really project work. We do project work with children, and we have children follow what they're interested in, and the differences in their abilities to both use and apply math, and in their vocabularies. All of those things are so different when they are involved in something that they really, really want to know. Whether it's how that road machine is making a new road, to whether, why the fox eats the mice in the woods. Those kinds of things can have a huge effect on the depth of the thinking that children do when they're motivated, and when they have teachers who are responsive to that. And I'm picking up then on, the executive functioning of the teachers there, which is really key in that relationship. But motivation and paying attention to children's, what they are interested in, what their intellectual lives are. So the intellectual lives of children are very individualized, and they're very culturally tied. And the way that people react to and interact with them regarding these intellectual lives, I think is really important. And again, and kudos to everyone who's doing this research. But these are the things that I think are so important and then so difficult to get a handle on.
Thank you, Judy. Rebecca, I don't mean to come in and talk over the top of you, but I am aware that time's up. If people want to stay on and talk, please do so. But I wanted to be polite to the presenters who have given their time, and thank you so much. This has been just a wonderful symposium. It's been fantastic. So I really, really want to say a big thank you to you for taking the time, and the recording will be uploaded. So if you've registered, you'll get a notification that the recording is available. And this, I would say, this is one of the best CEN seminars we've held. So thank you.
Thanks again. Oh, James also asked Rebecca if the chat would be saved.
Oh, sorry. Yes, I did reply to him, but it went direct. I didn't mean it to. So I'll make sure the settings include the chat, so you can have a look at that too.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, Rebecca, for doing all the work and putting it together.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you, all of you. And thank you, Rebecca, for brilliant hosting. I had a night off.
Thank you. Great name. Just the best.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you for
I'm
coming.
also partial to Andrew, for what it's worth.
Sorry, what was that, Andy?
I'm also partial to the name Andrew.
Yeah, a couple of Andys here as well. Yeah, thank you everybody for the great questions as well, and the discussion, just brilliant. Thanks
I think
very
the
much.
questions really did support the kind of rethinking executive function argument, right? Like really taking into consideration what are our students' goals and interests, and it was really validating to hear.
Yeah, so important. Yeah, instead of just taking it and running with it and sticking it in as a measure, really delving deep to find out what are we talking about it, and is it worthwhile, So just great.
Yeah, something we've thought about is kind of researchers, because of our ego, we want to be the ones who come up with this amazing intervention that works really well in the settings, but actually there are people on the ground already doing those things. We just need to support them in doing it rather. So the ego of researchers needs to drop a level to get back on the ground.
Yeah, a bit of a backseat. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, feel free to leave off. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
It's the witching hour. My dogs have started barking.
Yeah. 8 o'clock at night my side, so I'm gonna head as well.
Okay. Thanks, Caylee.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Good to see you again, Rebecca. Good to meet you, Dana and Andy, properly. And thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.